the Caribbean called St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Came to this country when he was 18 to study medicine, and in many ways my father attempted to bring his sort of small village life to America. It did not work, and I talked a bit about that, but I'm going to approach the topic a little bit differently this time. It's a little bit more personal, and a little bit more of a theological approach this evening. So I'm a little trepidatious to invite people into how my mind works, but I'm going to attempt to do that, and I hope that you get something out of it. I thank you for being with me. We're going to go on a journey together, so just hang with me. If you're from City Team, which there's a number of you guys, you hear me talk about a lot of things you're going to be familiar with that I talk about in our classes and our lectures. But tonight is an opportunity for you to see the biblical foundation for those things and how they have personally connected me throughout my life. Deal? Sound good?
Yes.
So the talk is A Desert Theology of Liberation, the journey of God's people as refugee, outsider, slave, and exile in the urban wilderness. I will say that I have I was born and raised in the Christian faith. I was actually born and raised in a movement called the Seventh-day Adventist movement. I left that tradition when I was in my early 20s, and then was still a Christian, but I searched for a really long time. I didn't go to church for a real good long time. Started farming, moved to Pennsylvania, dated a girl named Allison, who actually brought me back to church, and I was introduced to Reformed theology, which was very new to me. And I learned a lot about Reformed theology. I ended up going to Westminster Theological Seminary, which is the place to study Reformed theology. But it was really in college that I was introduced to liberation theology. So I've lived kind of in those two worlds. For those of you that are not familiar with liberation theology was primarily a Roman Catholic movement birthed out of the 50s and 60s in Latin America. And liberation theology really, the purpose of that movement was to hear theology articulated from people in poverty, people that had historically experienced a lot of economic, political, and historical oppression. For most of us in the West, Christianity has mostly been espoused and articulated by those from Western Europe, which isn't bad. I'm not here to say that that's a bad thing, but it does also mean that there are other voices within the Christian world of people that are also espousing theology. So liberation theology in many ways seeks to hear how those people groups in the so-called third world countries, how they understand Scripture, how they experience the gospel message in the kingdom. When I was introduced to liberation theology in college, it felt like coming home. My father is an immigrant to this country, and my mother, who's mixed racially and ethnically. The things that liberation theologians were talking about were things that were talked about in my home all the time. There was nothing controversial in my home about talking about poverty, about talking about racism, about talking about social injustice. Those were not even really I didn't really even think of those things as being political topics. It was just things that my family talked about. My mother is mixed white, black, and Native American, and she grew up in this country in the 60s and 70s, so you can sort of imagine what her experience was like. My father is an East Indian from the West Indies that came to this country, a very dark-skinned Indian man, studying medicine in this country. So those were things that were just sort of my worldview. And I had gone to church for years, and I wasn't really able to talk about what it was like for me to experience the gospel from that perspective. And I realized that there was an entire theological tradition of minorities espousing theology from a very similar worldview that I grew up with. I would not say that I'm only sort of put myself there. I am definitely somebody that has a deep appreciation for many theological traditions. So even though I'm primarily going to be speaking about liberation theology tonight, I have an equal appreciation for many of the theological traditions. I just want to make that known. So I'm going to begin this evening by sharing a story that is very sacred to me, and that story is the birth of my son. What you're seeing here is the first ultrasound image of my son named Israel. You can go to the next slide. If you aren't a doctor, and I assume that many of you are probably not medical physicians here, like me, I didn't really know what I was looking at. But at 10 weeks, when the radiologist came to give us the results of this ultrasound, we sort of heard the the words that no parent wants to hear. And that's when the radiologist came to us and said, "I see something that I do not like." And of course, my wife Rebecca and I were just like, okay, well, what is he talking about? What does he mean? And basically what he then explained to us, looking at this scene, is that when you see my son's chest area, that should actually be clear. You should actually almost physically be able to see through my son's chest, because that's where the lungs are. But what you're actually looking at is a massive tumor in my son's chest. We did not know it was a tumor at the time. We found out that it was something later on called CCAM. CCAM is something that stands for Congenital Cystic Edematoid Malformation. Now, as you can imagine, I never knew what that was before, but I remember being in the hospital saying cystic congenital edematoid malformation, just trying to figure out what that was. And as a good X-generation millennial type person, I just went and did all the research I could on to figure out what this thing was and if there's anything that we could do. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that this mass, which they really described as non-functioning lung tissue, that was essentially taking up my son's chest. And the worst thing that could happen is that it would grow so large that it would push up against my son's heart and compromise and essentially put him in cardiac arrest and kill him. So we immediately, my father is a physician, so my father immediately flew us down to Florida, and we were just trying to figure out what the prognosis of our son would be, because we wanted to keep our son, we wanted him to be healthy. So literally, there was chaos in my son's chest. That is the only way to explain it, because it was lung tissue that was non-functioning. So it means that essentially he was completely dependent on my wife to breathe. And so if he were to be born with this mass in his chest, he would essentially die because he would not be able to breathe on his own. So we were trying to figure out what to do. And so we went to see a specialist in Florida, and then what's sort of ironic is that the fetal specialist in Florida said, "Have you ever heard of a hospital called CHOP?" And we were like, "Actually, yes, we live 15 minutes from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia." And she's like, "Great, you need to go back there, because that is the one place in the world where they actually specialize in congenital cystic edematoid malformation." And we found out that the doctor who actually pioneered the surgery is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Adzik, and he actually has residency at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So it was unbelievable. So they're like, "Why are you in Florida? You need to go back." So they sent us back to CHOP. And then my wife ended up going, she had to go to CHOP twice a week to get ultrasounds and to figure out how they were going to develop a treatment plan. There's two options that she had. Either they would actually perform in utero surgery, which is, I didn't even know something that they did. They would basically open her up and then operate on the child inside of her belly. That was one option. That's like worst case scenario. We did not want that to happen. Or they could give her some sort of medication that could help manage the size of basically this massive chaos in his chest. So she ended up being a candidate for the experimental sort of steroid that they gave her, and it did for a while help manage the size of the chest, the size of the mass in his chest. You can go to the next slide. So what you're seeing here is essentially a healthy lung. This is what a healthy lung looks like, where it's clear. And this is what my son's chest looked like, where you basically just see a mass that's growing inside there. You can go to the next slide. So the question is, what was that experience like for my wife and I? I didn't realize it at the time, but I was experiencing what I would later learn is a kind of dislocation. My wife and I were stressed. We felt very isolated. We felt powerless. There was really nothing that we could do except sort of consult with doctors and pray and get family support. We were scared. We lived in fear every day that we would lose our child. What I haven't shared is that, for an entire year, my wife, we have a daughter who was very healthy at the time, and then a couple years had gone by and we were ready to try for another. My wife had had a couple of miscarriages. My wife was in a really horrible car accident. And so we had a lot going on. And so when she finally got pregnant, we were so happy, and then this happened. So we had been going through a number of different really tragic events. So we felt alone and desperate. Our world got very small. Our world was essentially me going to work. I was working at the time at Malvern, which is an inpatient addiction treatment facility. I was working long hours there, and then I would literally leave Malvern and go straight to CHOP to go with Rebecca. Sometimes Rebecca would go during the day, sometimes she would go in the evening. So that's one thing that I can say is that our world got very, very small. You can go to the next slide. At this time, I started thinking about at this time, I started thinking a lot about chaos. Now, chaos is a word that we use generally, right? My life's chaos, or my life's chaotic. But I started actually thinking about it in more technical terms and more clinical terms. I was like, my life right now is in chaos. And then I started thinking about what I was saying, and I realized that at Malvern, I would hear my clients often talk about chaos. And it was something that the therapists would talk about, counselors, our clients. I was working with people in recovery, right? People would come to Malvern, get detoxed. People were in early recovery from substance abuse. And so the term chaos just seemed to be something everyone was talking about. And then I remembered, as a good religious studies student, I remembered this story. And I was like, wait a minute, isn't there this version of the Bible story where God is fighting against chaos? But then I was like, wait a minute, but Christians have disputed that. That's not a thing, And so I remember thinking to myself, wait a minute, I feel like that's something I'd like to look into, because not only was there literal chaos in my son's chest, not my life was in chaos, but I feel like there was chaos all around me. And I was like, there's something where I feel like I'm gravitating towards wanting to understand what this means. So what I discovered is that it actually is a thing. The Germans actually even have a word for it, and it's called the Chaos Kampf. The Chaos Kampf in German literally means the chaos struggle. And what they describe is that there is this story that is told, actually, in almost every culture and religious tradition that you can think about, there seems to be some version of this story. And the story goes like this, that there's some god or gods that are fighting against some sort of beast or dragon or giant octopus or some sort of force of chaos that they have to go to war against. And so this is actually a very famous painting by Gustave Doré, a French painter, and he actually tries to capture, just sort of illustrate what that looks like. That's Yahweh, the Jewish God of the Old Testament, coming down to slay the dragon Leviathan, who in Scripture is also called the sea serpent. I love this painting, by the way. You can go to the next slide. And then I started looking up different versions of this story, and you realize, wow, there's some version of this story that shows up in a lot of different religions and a lot of different cultures. There's a Japanese version, there's the ancient Babylonian version, that's William Blake's St. Michael binding the dragon in the book of Revelation. There's Thor over there fighting some sort of beast. And most recently, there's Kubo and Two Strings, which is an animated film where he's also going to war with some version of the Chaos Monster. So I was like, wow, so this is a thing. All over the world, humans seem to really value this story. And it seems like it's a very important story, so much so that this story actually seems to keep on told over and over again. That it is an important story for humans to understand, there are forces of chaos all around us. And that it is important for us to tell stories of some supreme being or God that is able to conquer those forces of chaos. You have to understand, as a person of faith that was working with people in recovery in an addiction treatment facility, and every client is telling me that their life was chaos and addiction, I was always looking for ways to connect my faith tradition in appropriate ways, with them. And I was like, this seems to be a major theme. And that if this is a universal story that seems to not only be within my religious tradition, but other religious traditions and cultures, it seems like an important story for me to study and to know about. So I dug a little bit deeper. Next slide, please. So I just saw the new Avengers movie with my wife. It was wonderful. I'm not a big Marvel Comics person, but even so, this is just a really good modern-day example. Hydra, which is actually this sort of like three-headed dragon, is actually a mythological creature that Hercules fights against. Well, that term Hydra is actually just what, in the Avengers, this is a terrorist organization. That's the name of the terrorist organization that the Avengers are fighting against. And the terrorist organization is also named Hydra. So this is just a really good example of how modern-day stories and comic books, and these stories get retold over and over again, and they're often pulling from this very ancient story of some sort of chaos monster or chaos beast that is continually reincarnating itself into systems and terrorist groups and oppressive political regimes. So it's a thing that keeps on sort of showing up and almost universally in Star Wars, you name it, it's everywhere. Go to the next slide. So, okay, these are the ancient symbols of chaos, death, and destruction. They often come in forms of dragons, sea serpents, giant squids. Anyone grew up watching 2000 Leagues Under the Sea? That was like one of my favorite films growing up. Violent waters, demons, skulls. Basically, symbols of chaos, death, and destruction. It's trying to capture there's some sort of extreme, harsh environment and or some sort of hostile beast or creature. This seems to show up universally in traditions. You can go to the next slide. So, interestingly enough, these very things, these very images and symbols, I will tell you what, as soon as I started studying this, when I was working with clients in early recovery, I started noticing their tattoos. And I'll tell you what, it seemed like everywhere I turned, one of my clients had some sort of tattoo of some ancient symbol of chaos. It was tattoos of dragons, tattoos of demons, tattoos of giant octopus. And I would sit down with my clients and say, hey, listen, tell me about your tattoo. I'm super interested. And 9 out of 10 times, they would say, do you see that? That's my addiction. It's almost like they needed, or it was almost like in the human subconscious. You know, Jung talks about the collective unconscious, that there's this kind of universal human consciousness. It's as if my clients needed to symbolize, they needed to see, they needed to mark their body to say, this is my addiction, because they wanted to be reminded that that is what they were fighting against. And I'm talking about most of my clients, if not all of them, were atheists, secular, wanted nothing to do with religion. Most of them were very hostile to religion. Even the most secular atheist client almost felt the need to mark up their body with some demonic, draconian monster image because they needed that symbolism. It helped them. It was a reminder to them. It was a mark for them to know this is some force that is destroying my life. And I need to be reminded of that, to look at it every day. And I'm like, well, hey, let me share a story with you. That's actually, you know, it ended up being this really powerful entry point for me to talk to my clients about the story of the chaos struggle. Next slide. Now, there's a part of me that said, but wait a minute. The early church decided long, long time ago that God created the universe out of nothing. In Latin, this doctrine in the Christian church is called collectio ex nihilo. It's a very famous doctrine. You pick up any random systematic theology book, and it talks about the doctrine of creation, you're going to end up with this Latin term. And the reason why the early church decided, and when I mean the early church, I'm talking about, you know, the Western church. The reason when they were forming their doctrines, the primary purpose of a lot of doctrinal development was to fight heresy, because they wanted to preserve some sort of concept of God that they thought was very important. The early church, and again, I think this is fine and good, the early church did really want to preserve this idea that God is completely sovereign. They wanted to communicate nothing can oppose God. There was no pre-existent material that God had to God's not playing with Play-Doh, before. That's basically the idea. They're like, no, we need to preserve this idea that God is completely independent, completely sovereign, completely all-powerful. But there's a problem. This doctrine doesn't show up anywhere in the Bible. You won't find it. I've read the Bible many times, and I will, no pun intended, go to war with you if you think it does. It doesn't. And the ancient Israelites did not believe this. And I'm hoping to prove why that's important. I'm not hoping to prove it to debate with anybody, but I'm hoping to prove it because I did a little experiment, and I said, let me just set aside this doctrine. Let me just sort of put it on the shelf. And let me embrace the chaos struggle other version. And let me see what happens if I read the Bible. And let me see what happens with my own faith. As I'm going through this intense chaos struggle with my son, and my whole life seems like it's, in a whirlwind. So I did an experiment. I said, let me go ahead and set aside this doctrine that I've been taught. I'm not rejecting it. I'm just sort of put it on the shelf. And let me see what happens when I read the Bible and I embrace this theme of the Chaos Kampf. Let's see what happens. Next slide. So the reason why this was also important to me is because the story of a God that creates the universe out of nothing has no connection to my life. My life was this. That was my son in the NICU after he was born. He had to have major surgery. They removed 3/4 of his lung. As you can see, he's on life support, being kept alive by machines. After my son was born, my life sank even into deeper chaos. And so I'll tell you what, the story of a God that can fight against the forces of chaos and triumph was really important to me. Because that's the kind of God I wanted to believe in. A God that was kind of like a clockmaker or an artist, or creating something out of nothing that had no connection to my life. There was no connection. And I realized that God's people felt the same way. That God's people in times of conflict and crisis and dislocation needed that same story. They also needed to believe in a God that was a warrior that could successfully fight against the forces of chaos and win. And so that's obviously me in the making with my son. But the point of this slide is that not only was it very difficult for me to find the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo in the Bible, but it was difficult for that doctrine to have any connection towards my life. Next slide. It turns out that this shows up everywhere in the Bible. I could not almost find a place in the journey of God's people in the Bible where there wasn't some sort of illustration that God absolutely is prioritizing fighting against the forces of chaos. God divides the waters at creation. The waters for the ancient Israelites was an absolutely symbol of chaos. It shows up in the Psalms. There's a couple of places in the Psalms where it says that God goes to war with the waters. God divides the waters again at the Red Sea as the Israelites are fleeing from the chaos of slavery. God divides the waters again at the River Jordan with Joshua. God guides his people through the desert itself being a harsh environment. It's also a symbol of chaos. God overcomes the dragons Rahab and Leviathan in the book of Job. God overcomes the violent waters and slays Rahab and Leviathan in the Psalms. God slays Leviathan in the book of Isaiah. Christ conquers the devil in the wilderness. Christ calms the storm and casts out demons in the Gospels. And in the book of Revelation, Christ conquers the dragon and the beast in the book of Revelation. So I'm like, wait a minute. This thing shows up everywhere. It seems really important. And in the next couple of slides, I want to show you why this story from Genesis to Revelation is so important for God's people. And why when the church established the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, when they established that doctrine that God created the universe out of nothing, it was almost a complete divorcing themselves of the mind of the ancient Israelite. They were thinking like philosophers. They were thinking like Western philosophers. They were not thinking like a tribal warrior people that had to fight against the forces of chaos in order to survive. Next slide. So how do we understand chaos? So the language that we encounter in the book of Genesis is that the language of darkness over the face of the deep, formless and void, and the waters. These are sort of the imagery of the book of Genesis. Now, a very easy way for me to understand what chaos means in this text is that when we are introduced to the heavens and the earth in the book of Genesis, it's a complete mess. It's confusion, it's chaos, and we can define that, but there's a lack of balance, there's a lack of order, there's a lack of rhythm, and there's a lack of harmony. So much so that I could absolutely confront any person in early recovery and say, hey, was there a lack of balance in your life? How about order? Did you have any of that, or rhythm, or harmony? And they say no. Exactly. So not only am I seeing this in Scripture, but I'm also able to connect those truths with people that I work with, my clients that are just coming out of addiction. And every person I would say, yeah, that's pretty much me. No balance, no harmony, no order, and absolutely no rhythm. Next slide. Now, as like many ancient people, the ancient Israelites sort of had this concept of the four primal elements. And this shows up again in a lot of different cultures and religions. Of course, there's water, fire, wind, and earth. Now, when the Bible talks about chaos, it typically is one of these elements taken to the extreme. A whole other lecture I could do is how this also shows up as God's symbol of judgment. That when God brings judgment, it's almost as if God is sort of disturbing the primal created order. So the flood shows up as extreme water, the imagery of hell is extreme fire, the imagery of the whirlwind and storm is extreme wind, and extreme earth shows up in the scriptures as the desert and the wilderness or droughts. So basically when the Bible talks about chaos, it's typically one element that's taken to the way extreme, so much so that it's hostile to life. And that theme ends up being very important in Scripture because God uses those extreme conditions as important marks of transition for his people. You can go to the next slide. So what's really powerful about the earth, as far as we know, earth is the only place in the entire universe that has those four elements in perfect harmony, rhythm, order, and balance for life to exist. We have not discovered another planet that does that. That is miraculous. So the earth itself represents a triumph over chaos. And what's so interesting is that it's the same for human life. That human life, just like the earth, those four things have to also be in perfect balance for human life to even exist. You can go to the next slide. So when I was in the NICU, when I would overhear the doctors and the nurses talk about my son, what are they looking for? They're essentially looking for those four elements to also be in perfect balance. They're checking my son's fluids. Are fluids flowing through his body in healthy ways? Is his body temperature okay? How are his bones forming? And how is his breathing, which obviously for my son was the most important thing. So it's almost as if the doctors and the nurses are like, hey, are these things in perfect balance? Are the primal elements of God's creation in perfect balance in your son? Of course they're not saying that. I'm like the religious theology nerd thinking those things, but that's essentially what they're saying. Are water, fire, earth, and wind in perfect balance in this human person? And they weren't, which is why he's strapped up to all that. But the idea, right, is that in many ways the nurses and the doctors are sort of reenacting the creation story. Because like God, they're trying to take those forces of chaos and bring them in perfect balance. So what? So my son can live without all that machinery, which he eventually did. Praise God. So again, they are working not with nothing, but they're working with the basic building blocks of life. And they're also, like God, fighting against the forces of chaos within my son to make sure that these things are in sync with each other so my son can live on his own. Next slide, please. I love this. Someone posted this on Facebook the other day, and I just think it's really beautiful. It's just because it really shows the connection between man and the earth. But you are supported by a rigid skeleton made of minerals. You are earth. Your body is over 70% fluid. You are water. Your lungs take in and expel breath. You are air. And your blood is warm, and your brain runs on electric impulses. You are fire. So this is not like, I grew up in a tradition that was so critical of like New Age. Like, this isn't like New Age hippie stuff. Like, this is science, This is real stuff. The real has real concrete connections to science. So that's important for me. So it's just beautiful that that there is this real connection between Earths and humans in terms of the basic building blocks of life and how those things come together. Next slide. Now, what we can see then when we track the creation story is that God brings balance. The first thing that he says is, right, let there be light. And we know before that there was a sort of darkness, a sort of looming darkness. So God immediately brings balance. He's bringing light to the darkness. He immediately brings order. He separates the heavens and the earth, water and land, humans and animals, and male and female. He brings rhythm. He creates in a rhythmic recurring 7-day cycle of evening and morning. That the spiritual, mineral, plant, animal, and human, and celestial worlds are all interconnected. So again, we can understand chaos as the lack of these things, and now we can understand, well, what is the Spirit of God doing as it's hovering over the face of the water? It's essentially interacting with this force of chaos and bringing it into balance, order, rhythm, and harmony. Which, as a person working with people in early recovery, this is exactly what I hope to offer them, right? Amen? Well, I think all humans need this, right? This is universally human. All right, we can go to the next slide. Now, how does this all relate to the combat myth or the Chaos Kampf or the chaos struggle? How do we interact with that? I know that when I think about combat or when I think about the chaos struggle, I typically think of two opposing forces, right? I grew up with Mike Tyson, so I thought I'd throw Mike Tyson up there. I typically think about, when I think about combat or fighting or warfare, I typically think about two opposing forces kind of coming at each other. Now, that is the big thing that the early church fathers wanted to avoid. They're like, no, there's nothing that opposes God. God is not, it's not as if God is in some boxing ring, right, fighting another person. And I agree with that. And there's plenty of versions of the chaos myth or the Chaos Kampf, the creation story, where it is like two forces opposing each other. I agree. But then I asked my question, wait a minute, couldn't there be conflict without direct opposition? Is that a thing that actually exists? Because if we are saying, how do I, as a good Bible-reading Christian boy, I'm like thinking, well, how do I preserve God as being all-powerful, but also acknowledge that the Bible does speak to some genuine conflict that does happen between God and some force of chaos. But if it's not a direct opposition, if there's nothing that can directly oppose God, then is there some sort of conflict that does exist without direct opposition? And it turns out that it's a thing. And that thing is essentially the fastest growing martial arts movement in the past 20 years. And it's called, next slide, Jiu-Jitsu. The ancient art of Jiu-Jitsu basically says, guess what? You can have conflict without opposition. Jiu-Jitsu in Japanese literally means the gentle way. And what is Jiu-Jitsu? It is a method of martial arts that uses the opponent's force against themselves rather than meeting it with force. The goal of Jiu-Jitsu is to neutralize a fight without causing the enemy harm. The Jiu-Jitsu practitioner uses holds, pins, and submissions to neutralize the chaos and violence of a fight, thus creating order, balance, rhythm, harmony with the opposing force. Anyone that knows anything about ultimate fighting or MMA knows that you cannot compete competitively in any of those sports if you do not at least have a black belt in Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu has proven in ultimate fighting and mixed martial arts to be the most effective way to subdue your opponent. What is so beautiful about watching Jiu-Jitsu, it's not like boxing. It's not like people are like trying to beat, the whatever out of each other. It's not about bloody noses and like beating each other. Jiu-Jitsu, literally, you see people
subdue their opponents. There's no bloodshed. There's no harm. There's no broken noses. It's unbelievable to watch. Now, we are going to watch it in a little bit. I'm going to show you a fight. There is a gentleman by the name of Emilia Vanko Phaidor. This guy is known as like the Michael Jordan of mixed martial arts. He's a Russian guy. If you ever are interested, you could just YouTube videos of this guy fighting. He's a monster. He's a beast. His nickname is the Emperor. Now, he is known, similar to Mike Tyson back in the 90s, he's known as just completely annihilating and destroying his opponents with brute force. He just comes at you and he just destroys you. But what you're about to see is what it looks like for there to be conflict without opposition. Because what you're about to see is a fight between Phaidor and a Brazilian guy named Fabrizio. Fabrizio is a black belt in Jiu-Jitsu. And what you're about to see is Phaidor just unleash his fury on this guy. And at first you're like, this fight's over. Phaidor's taking this guy down and this guy's done. But what Fabrizio is able to do is he's gently able to grab Phaidor's arm and get him in an armbar. And before you know it, the fight's over. No bloodshed, no broken noses, no one's gotten really hurt. And you're just like, wait, what happened? How is this even a thing? But it's so beautiful and magnificent to watch. There's actually a story that some people believe that the art of jiu-jitsu actually came from heaven. That it's some sort of ancient sacred martial art. Because when you watch it, again, it's so effective and it works so quickly. But you're like, how in the world can you execute a martial art so effectively and actually not harm anybody? It's crazy. But it gives us the concept and paradigm of jiu-jitsu, helps us understand, okay, maybe there is some sort of divine form of engaging in conflict that's actually able to bring about more peace. So you can go to the next slide. So we're going to watch this. Bear with me. saw it.
I couldn't quite get how what it was that he won, or what.
Yeah, exactly. It's confusing, right?
What did it do that he said, "Oh, you got it"?
So in MMA, when you're dumb, you tap out. So Phaidor tapped out. So what it means is that he's essentially tapping his opponent. So it's strange, right? It's a little strange to look at because what you're actually seeing is somebody is able, you can go back to the PowerPoint, somebody is able to take the brute force of another person and almost absorb it, neutralize it, hold them in perfect tension. And basically what Fabrizio, the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy, is doing, he's holding the guy's arm with such tension that Phaidor knows that if he continues to use his brute force against the other person, that he will break his arm. So in order to avoid his arm being broken, he has to surrender. And that's what happens, and that is the power of Jiu-Jitsu, that it holds somebody in perfect tension, that it forces them to stop using their brute force, and thus you have the neutralization of the conflict. And so why that is so beautiful, as I've said before, is that it doesn't require any harm to happen. Again, both of those guys are completely walking away from that fight and no one really got injured or hurt at all. When that's the whole point of the sport, right? To beat the other person up. But yet here is a way to engage with conflict and opposition and brute force that actually creates rhythm, harmony, or imbalance between people and ends the fight quickly. And the reason why that's so powerful is in understanding how God works is because we see that when God wants to train his people to fight the forces of chaos, he actually offers them something similar. And I'll show you how that works. We can go to the next slide. So the foundation of all jiu-jitsu and many Japanese martial arts is what is called the kata. Kata in Japanese means order. What is the kata? Kata is a set of prearranged patterns of rhythmic movements to prepare the warrior for the chaos of the battlefield. So the idea behind this is the samurai is like, listen, the battlefield's chaotic. But the samurai say to themselves, but if I can learn these rhythmic prearranged movements, then I'm much more likely to be able to control what happens in the battlefield. Now, what am I saying? I'm saying that God gives his people the creation story to prepare them to face the forces of chaos and to remind them that he has the power to conquer them. The Exodus story is then used in the same way, to remind God's people during times of chaos and dislocation that if he slayed the dragon before, that he can do it again. You with me? All right, go ahead, next slide. How does he do this? So when God's people are delivered from slavery in Egypt, almost immediately after they are delivered from slavery, God gives them sacred harvest festivals. Now, this is a term that I've coined called the sacred metronomes of remembrance. Anyone that's a musician knows what a metronome is, right? It keeps time. So basically, what is God doing? God's saying, listen, you're going to go into the wilderness and the desert. You're fresh, coming out of slavery. I mean, God's people at this point are psychologically beaten down. The story tells us that they've been enslaved for 400 years. This is like generational slavery at this point. So it's safe to say that God's people are experiencing a lot of trauma. And God is essentially saying, listen, when you enter into the wilderness, you are going to want to come back to slavery. You are going to want to return to slavery. And so I need to give you not only timekeepers to help you have a rhythmic way of life, but I also need for these festivals to remind you of important spiritual truths. Because when you're in chaos, when you're experiencing depression and desperation and devastation, your mind's going to be distorted. Your thinking's going to be distorted. And in the Bible, they call it idolatry. You're going to want to turn to idolatrous behavior. And God gives them these rhythms and says, listen, I'm going to give you the Sabbath because you need to remember to rest and to not make money and consumption your gods. I'm going to give you the Passover because you need to remember that you were once slaves and that slavery was horrible and that God delivered you. I'm going to give you the Feast of First Fruits because you need to remember to be grateful and beware of entitlement. I'm going to give you the Feast of Weeks to remember to be generous and to beware of greed. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to give you the Feast of Trumpets to remember to give praise to God and beware of cynicism. I'm going to give you the Day of Atonement to remember that you and other people's sins have been forgiven, so beware of holding resentments. And I'm going to give you the Feast of Booths to remember to give thanks for your basic needs being met and beware of being taken for granted. So these things for God had significant significance for the cultural and religious expression of his people. Because God knows, listen, when you're desperate in the wilderness, you're going to forget all these things. You're going to take things for granted. You're going to hold resentments. You're going to become cynical. You're going to romanticize what slavery was like, all these things. And so these things for God, in many ways, God is saying, listen, these pre-arranged rhythmic movements are the kata that you're going to need in order to fight the chaos in the wilderness. Because these things are going to help you move. And not only will they help you move and navigate the destitution of the wilderness, but they're going to keep you together as a people. They're going to keep you knit together through cultural and religious expression. You with me? Okay, next slide. So basically God is saying, I'm going to give you a kata of festivals. Zeitgeber, this is another really great German word. It means timekeeper. So basically God is giving them timekeepers. These festivals shaped the cultural and sacred understanding and keeping of time for God's people. They provide psychosocial integration, meaning they establish a sense of social belonging, communal identity, and psychological well-being. Boundaries, they created necessary boundaries with opposing systems of greed and idolatry, which I'll talk about more. And harmony, they preserved an economy of all beings working together in harmony. And resilience, ends up being the big theme, that they help the people survive spiritually and culturally in times of dislocation and chaos. That is essentially what I'm saying is God's kata for his people. He's saying you're going to need these things. Because when you face other forces of chaos, and if you don't have these things, you will die as a people. And the true religion of God will essentially no longer exist. Next slide. Dislocation. Dislocation is a breakdown of psychosocial integration through cultural, social, psychological, and spiritual devastation and impoverishment. In the Bible, God's people experience dislocation in 4 distinct ways. They experience dislocation as refugees. They long for survival. We see that with Abraham fleeing to Egypt in time of drought and famine. Again, with Jacob. It's the experience of being an outsider. You long for belonging and acceptance. They experience it as slaves, longing for liberation or freedom. And they experience it as exiles, longing for a home. You can, in fact, read the entire Bible and see how God's people experience these 4 distinct experiences of dislocation. Meaning that when God's people experience being refugees, outsiders, slaves, and exiles, that kata of festivals that I just talked about, God's saying that's when those things become the most important. Because it's times when you're experiencing dislocation that you're going to be the most vulnerable to destructive behavior. And I need you to be knit together as a people. I need for you to come together and celebrate these things and remind yourselves of these spiritual truths. Because if you don't have those things, you're just going to be sucked up by whatever the imperial forces of the day. Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Assyria, and in the New Testament, Rome. Which God's people constantly have to figure out how to have a relationship with without their religion being destroyed. Next slide. Now, where do I get this motif from? I get this motif actually from the Apostle Stephen's sermon in Acts 7. That Stephen actually identifies these as being the 4 main identities of God's people. Stephen makes reference to God's people as refugees. When he said there was a great famine in the land and our fathers could not find any food. So Jacob went down to Egypt. So they're experiencing drought and famine and fleeing to what the imperial force was of the day, Egypt. Outsiders. Until another king arose in Egypt and dealt shrewdly with our race. So again, we see that even though Jacob and his family lived in Egypt, when another king arose in Egypt, they perceived the Hebrews as outsiders and then enslaved them. Slaves. His offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, and he would enslave and afflict them for 400 years. Stephen identifies that this is a significant experience for for God's people. And exiles. And I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. So just so you know, this is the biblical foundation of where I'm getting these identities from. That when Stephen retells the story of God's people, he basically says, listen, you are refugees, outsiders, slaves, and exiles. And Stephen's sermon to his fellow Jews is not like it's not like a pep talk. He's like casting judgment on them, because he's basically saying, listen, when you were refugees, outsiders, slaves, and exiles, guess what? You were stiff-necked and rebellious. And so the question I'm asking is, why is it that when God's people experience intense times of dislocation, are they more prone to what the Bible considers to be destructive and idolatrous, or you could say addictive behavior? Next slide. Dislocation and the chaos struggle. In times of prolonged dislocation, the ancient Israelites would invoke the Chaos Kampf, meaning that they would invoke this story of God's triumph over the dragon and the forces of chaos as an instrument of psychological and theological resilience. Also, in times of dislocation, the ancient Israelites significantly preserved their religious, cultural identity and way of life through Sabbath keeping and the Passover observance when facing new forces of chaos. So again, these are the weapons, the gentle weapons, that God is giving his people to fight the forces of chaos. So much so that in times of exile, which is most of the Old Testament, when God's people are in exile, these two things show up everywhere. In the Psalms, mostly in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that the prophets are invoking this story, saying, listen, just as God destroyed the dragon back in the day, he's going to fight the dragon that's we're facing today. And how do we fight the dragon? By keeping the Sabbath and keeping the Passover, because those things are the kata. They are the pre-arranged rhythmic movements that God is using to preserve us as a people. All right, next slide. Here's just a really good example of how the ancient Israelites reflect backwards, remembering. The context of this passage, Psalm 74, is a lament to the people when they're in a context of Babylonian captivity. And what do they say? Speaking of God, you divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan, and you gave him as food for creatures of the wilderness. Again, this is a time when God's people needed to remember that God was a warrior. And because in the Babylonian captivity, they're facing a new dragon. So it's as if God's people are saying, listen, we are facing a new force of chaos, so we need to be reminded so we don't lose hope that just as God at the beginning of creation slayed the dragon then, he's going to slay the dragon for us today. Next slide. This is in Isaiah 27. Again, this is in a context of Babylonian captivity where God's people are fighting hopelessness, they're fighting desperation, they're fighting sadness, they're fighting depression, and they again need to be reminded. But this one is future focused. The Psalm 74 passage was a remembering of what God did in the past. But Isaiah 27 is what the people are saying is going to happen in the future. They're saying, in that day, the Lord, with his hand and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan. Leviathan here is a reference to a dragon, right? That is a symbol for Babylon. Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. So we have two motifs here, that the dragon is something that God slayed back in the day, and he's something that he will help his people to slay in the future. Next slide. And again, so these two things go hand in hand when God's people are in exile. Not only do they need to remember that God is a warrior God that slays the dragon, but again, the prophets over and over again in exile say, remember the Sabbath. Remember this timekeeper, this sacred metronome of remembrance. Remember it. Because if you forget it, you're going to be lost as a people. But keep the Sabbath day and do not work on it. But if you do not listen to me, keep the Sabbath day holy, and not to bear a burden and enter by the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem and shall not be quenched. Again, the Sabbath is a big deal for God, for his people in times of exile, because God is essentially saying, if you don't have this regular rhythmic timekeeper, the force of chaos is going to consume you. Next slide. Just one more example. Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. Sanctified again in the Hebrew means to be set apart. So God is always saying, I want to set my people apart. And what sets God's people apart is that they keep the sacred parameters of God. That God's people are the ones that live according to his sacred rhythms. But the house of Israel, again, he judges them because the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes, but rejected my rules, by which if a person does them, he shall live, and my Sabbaths they greatly profaned. Next slide. So the question I put forth is, why was it so difficult for Israel to walk in God's statutes and follow his rules in the wilderness? Well, the wilderness was a significant time of dislocation for God's people. Israel was transitioning from 400 years of slavery into a harsh environment, and they had become addicted to Egypt, their oppressor and slave master. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. Next slide. So there are two names for Egypt that the Bible gives us. The first name is Rahav, and the second name is Mitzrayim. Now, Rahav literally, like Leviathan, refers to an ancient dragon that God conquered at the beginning of creation. But it also is a reference to a new imperial and draconian force that opposes God's people. And of course, for God's people, that was Egypt, who enslaved them for 400 years. In the Psalms, in the book of Job, and the prophets, Rahab or Rahav is often referred to as a dragon, and it's a reference to Egypt. But the other term for Egypt is Mitzrayim, which literally means narrow straits. In later Jewish tradition, Mitzrayim was understood not so much as a geographical place, but as a diseased state of mind, when thinking, feeling, and believing become constricted. So when you think of Mitzrayim, what you're really thinking of is this kind of narrowing of the mind. So you could say it was very easy to take the Israelites out of Egypt, but it wasn't easy to take Egypt out of the Israelites. Next slide. This is a quote from Estelle Frankel. She writes a really powerful book called Sacred Therapy, and this is what she says. The exile of the Israelites in Mitzrayim represents a condition of self-alienation, of not being in one's true place. In exile, we become disconnected from our own true nature and inner being, and our lives slide out of sync with our inner essence. And what she means by that is that basically there's some sort of disease, some sort of mental pathology that happens to us that she understood to be almost an impoverishment of the spirit. Next slide. So we can understand chaos, but that these two forces work together. The force of Rahav and Mitzrayim work together to both destroy social, psychological, and cultural ways of life and isolate the individual in a state of self-alienation. In this state of dislocation, an individual and a society will turn to the most expedient way to adapt and cope. This is how idolatry functions for God's people in times of stress, isolation, and powerlessness. The times when God's people in the Bible are most prone to idolatrous behavior is essentially when they're in one of those states of refugee, outsider, slave, and exile. And that's why God is so harsh. I mean, for us now in this day and age, it feels like, whoa, God is way too intense about the Sabbath. But what God is thinking in this moment is like, listen, if I want my people to survive and not die off, then this is absolutely paramount. It's difficult for us in this day and age to appreciate that. But that is how we have to enter into the biblical mindset, is that God is thinking, if the punishment for breaking the Sabbath was so intense, but God's like, hey, if I got to kill a couple people to preserve my entire people, I'm going to do it. Because those one or two people that are corrupting and profaning my Sabbath have the potential to destroy my entire people. It seems harsh, but that's how he's thinking. Next slide. I'm just going to sort of explain the rat experiment. So while I was working at Malvern in the addiction treatment facility, a good friend of mine that was studying psychiatry in medical school sent me this comic strip, which I'll just explain. We don't have to take a look at it. There is a gentleman by the name of Bruce Alexander. Bruce Alexander is one of the pioneering researchers in addiction science. He mostly comes at it from a sort of a social psychological perspective. And he developed what is called the dislocation theory of addiction. And essentially, what Bruce Alexander is saying through this famous experiment that he did at Rat Park is he basically took rats in cages and he fed them basically a liquid form of opium. And he found that, absolutely, that rats in cages became addicted to the opioid pretty quickly. But then he was like, but wait a minute. He's like, a cage is not the rat's natural environment. So a true test would be, well, let me create like the Garden of Eden for rats. And now if they were in like the Garden of Eden for rats, would they then choose, over their natural food, would they then choose to take the opioid? And he discovered that they didn't. That when in their natural environment where they could play with other rats, make love with other rats, they have social gatherings with other rats, do whatever rats do communally, that they did not choose opioids. They just didn't do it. So he upped the ante. He's like, well, let me get a rat addicted to opium and then put him in Rat Park. And what he discovered is that even after getting a rat addicted in a cage to an opioid and then put him in Rat Park, the Rat Park essentially detoxed it. The rat essentially detoxed itself and then just lived a normal functioning life. So what Bruce Alexander said, well, wait a minute, there's some obvious differences between rats and humans, but he started thinking, it's like, wait a minute, maybe there's something happening socially in society that is sort of creating a similar experience for humans. What is a cage for humans? And he ended up writing an entire book about it called The Globalization of Addiction. So I read this book very quickly because I was very intrigued by his ideas. And then I emailed Bruce Alexander. And all the things that I've just been sharing with you about my sort of reading of the chaos struggle and the Bible and God's people, I wrote that to him. And I was like, hey, listen, I'm making a lot of connections between what you're writing in your book and my understanding of Scripture. You have to understand, Bruce Alexander is a complete atheist. He's a very scientifically minded guy. Not religious whatsoever. But he quickly wrote me back, which I was surprised that he did. And he's like, this is just my one plug for myself. He's like, this is awesome. He's like, your ideas are really interesting to me. And so we kept up a correspondence. And I was like, whoa. He thinks that I'm onto something. And he was very intrigued by my hermeneutic. He was very intrigued by my interpretation of Scripture because I realized that him and I were talking about a similar phenomenon, which I'll get into more later. But we can go to the next slide. This is essentially what Bruce Alexander is saying. Bruce Alexander is saying that the cage for us humans is free market society. And here's how he explains that. Although any person in any society can become dislocated, modern Western societies dislocate all their members to a greater or lesser degree because all members must participate in free markets that control labor, land, money, and consumer goods. Free markets require that participants take the role of individual economic actors, unencumbered by family and friendship obligations, clan loyalties, community responsibilities, charitable feelings, the values of their religion, ethnic group, or nation. So basically what is he saying? He's saying that the way that free markets function is that they have to be dominant of every sphere of your life. And any sacred loyalty that you want to have that is not dominated by the free market has to be negotiated. Next slide, please. This shows up in Scripture. In the book of Ezekiel 28, God actually has a very special judgment for what he calls the king of Tyre. The Tyrians were Phoenicians, and everyone knows the ancient Phoenicians as basically the pioneers of the trade system. They're the ones that pioneered the global trade system. The Phoenicians posed a major threat to the ancient Israelites in exile because of the seductive power of their goods and a trading system that did not acknowledge the sacred parameters of the Sabbath. Here's a passage where in Nehemiah where God says, the Tyrians also who lived in the city brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath. What is this evil thing that you are doing? Profaning the Sabbath day. So the prophet Nehemiah has a special judgment on the Phoenicians because guess what? Their trade system completely opposes the sacred rhythms for God's people. And this gets even more intense. Go to the next slide. In Ezekiel 28. So what is God saying through the prophet in Ezekiel 28? He's basically saying, listen, you've been corrupted by your trade system. In the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. By the multitude of your iniquities and the unrighteousness of your trade, you profaned your sanctuaries. Because your heart is proud and you have said, I am God. So what is God essentially saying about the Phoenicians? He's saying they have developed this trade system that not only puffs them up full of pride and makes them think that they're gods now, but it completely opposes the sacred rhythms of my people, and they are a threat. Therefore, I have judgment on them. So we find now a biblical precedent for saying, listen, there are certain systems that exist that God perceives as a threat to what he wants for his people. You can go to the next slide. And we see now how the nature of chaos works. Rahab in the Bible is a draconian and oppressive system that works against the cosmic, biological, and sacred parameters established by God. And then what is Mitzrayim? It is the state of alienation and desperation. It is a narrowing of the mind. And then how do we understand addiction? Addiction is an attempt to adapt to a prolonged state of dislocation through expedient means of relief. Is it clear? So these forces work over and over together to push people. And I'll give some examples of this. How are we doing? I'll try to speed things up here.
It's 10 minutes of 9.
Okay.
How much more do you have? Dare I ask?
This is just the introduction. I'm joking. Let's go to the next slide. Let's see how I'm doing here. I'll give you a couple examples of this. We'll blow through these. So 3 examples. One is Thomas Jefferson and the Indian Removal Act. One example, my favorite, is Green Eggs and Ham and the Karate Kid. I'll try to blow through these as quickly as possible. Let's go to the next one. So essentially, how did this work with Thomas Jefferson? The U.S. government essentially forcibly removed Native people from their land and then established trading posts to drive Native people into debt in order to take legal ownership of their land. So here we have, actually Thomas Jefferson was very deliberate and open about this. It's not like he was trying to hide it because he felt shameful about it, although there is some sense that maybe he had some sort of moral questions about what he was doing. But Thomas Jefferson was very deliberate to use these 2 forces. And we see how those 2 forces worked in Native people, that he, through the forced removal of their lands, and then for all intents and purposes, the Mitzrayim force is that the way of life of Native people in this country was completely destroyed. And they were forced into a trade system and money economy that destroyed their psychosocial integration. A lot of the research that Bruce Alexander does is actually on indigenous people in Canada, where this also took place, where basically the Canadian government forced Native people off their land, forced them into the money economy, and guess what rose? Addiction, alcoholism. So he does this research over and over again where he demonstrates that what I would call the Rahavic and Mitzrayim force working together on people to force them into desperate circumstances, into a consumeristic, materialistic society. Okay, you can go to the next slide. I'm going to skip the Green Eggs and Ham one, even though it's my favorite. Oh, should I? Okay, I can. We won't do the YouTube.
I just kind of like to have some time for questions too. So
Give me 5 more minutes.
You take as much time as you want. I just need to release people.
Of course.
But anyone who wants to stay can, of course.
Okay, I'll just do the Green Eggs and Ham. The Green Eggs and Ham example. So this is a very popular children's book. I've read it to my kids a million times. The popular interpretation of this book is basically, you got to get your kids to try new things, right? Right. This is what this book is about. This is not what this book is about, actually. I won't go through the entire book, but I'll summarize it. Basically, you have an isolated individual on a chair, and then you have Sam I Am, who comes riding on a beast. Doesn't that sound like biblical language? So you have Sam I Am coming riding on a beast and offering this man green eggs and ham. Now, the initial response of this individual is that he doesn't want green eggs and ham. He doesn't want it. Now, a respectable, honorable man of integrity would say, okay, this person doesn't want green eggs and ham. I'll leave them alone. Sam I Am does not leave this man alone. He does everything he can to get this person to eat green eggs and ham. And the point that I'm trying to make is that the way that this Sam I Am character gets the person to eventually eat the green eggs and ham is that he speeds the guy's life up and essentially puts him in a state of chaos. Puts him on a train, puts him in a low-hanging tree, puts him in a car. And then the biblical imagery actually gets more and more intense. He eventually brings him into darkness. Dr. Seuss is smart. Dr. Seuss knows exactly what he's doing. Sam Am's like, you don't want to try green eggs and ham? Well, I will get all Rahav on you. I will bring out Rahab. And I will put you in a state of chaos. And then let's see if you'll try green eggs and ham. So he puts them into utter darkness. Will you try them in the dark? And then eventually, the biblical imagery couldn't get more profound, in my opinion. And it's at the point where this man is completely submerged in the waters. In the ancient symbol of chaos, it's not until that this man has been completely, his life has been sped up, he's in chaos, and he's come drowning. And guess what the next page happens? He's like, all right. And look at his face. I'll try it. And we know the story. He can't stop eating it. He wants to now eat green eggs and ham everywhere. All the time. In a box, in a house, with a fox. What is Dr. Seuss telling us? Dr. Seuss is essentially retelling the Chaos Kampf story. But this is a tragic ending. Because Dr. Seuss is saying, listen, this is what society is doing to you. It finds you isolated. It finds you alone. It offers you something, and it doesn't care how much you reject it. Because as soon as you reject it, it's going to start creating chaos all around you, and it's going to beat you down and destroy you, and then it's going to offer it to you again. And then you find that you're so dislocated, you're so fragmented, and you're so broken that you can't stop taking it. If that's not addiction, I don't know what is. Sam Am is a drug pusher. And what Dr. Seuss, in my opinion, is commenting on is that this is how market forces work. Market forces don't care if you're having dinner. Market forces don't care if you got to do whatever sacred thing you want to do. It just doesn't care. There's a million other things that I want to say. And I eventually come to a solution, what my solution is to all this. But I'll skip to that point. So you can go to the very last slides. So much good stuff.
I know.
It's okay.
I think we have to have you back again.
So you can stop here. So what has been my solution to this in terms of my career and my life? And basically comes down to this. Several years ago, I visited a Camp Hill life sharing community about an hour from here near Phoenixville. And basically it's an intentional community of people that have decided to commit their lives to working with people with mental disabilities. Now, this is a movement that started in the 1930s and 40s in Scotland, and it was essentially several families that had members of their family that had intellectual and mental health problems. And at the time, those individuals were just sort of institutionalized, and society sort of gave up on them and sort of sold them out to the medical industrial complex. But these families came together and said, no, these people are made in the image of God. They absolutely can be productive. So they said, instead of forcing these individuals to be integrated into a society that's not caring about them, we're going to create our own alternative community. And that is what Camp Hill has done. Camp Hill has created, it's a global movement now of alternative communities that say we are going to absolutely live in harmony, rhythm, order, and balance with people with mental health disabilities by believing that they can be productive members of society. So my family, we are active volunteers in the Camp Hill community in Kimberton. I've been a volunteer and a friend of that community for about 10 years now. And I was inspired by what they did that I thought, well, wow, these market forces that I've sort of demonstrated that are connected to addictive behavior, my experience in the work that I've done is they deeply mostly affect people in poverty and marginalized people groups. And so since I've been doing the work of ministry and counseling, I've worked mostly with people in poverty, people coming out of prison, people coming out of rehab. And I decided, well, what would it look like for me to create a life-sharing community where I lived in solidarity with that group of people? Because what I learned so many times working with guys coming out of jail and coming out of rehab is that if there wasn't anything for them during that time, that crucial time of transition, that crucial time of dislocation, if there wasn't any set pattern of rhythmic activity, cultural expression, chances are that they were going to go back to some destructive environment or destructive behavior. So what my wife and I started 6 years ago, inspired by Camp Hill, was our own life-sharing community called the Negev. And the Negev essentially the model is Christian families living in solidarity with men coming out of the prison system and coming out of recovery. because we believe that if we can offer them psychosocial integration, if we can offer them community, if we can do life together, then that is a healthy way for us to respond to these forces of chaos. And that's essentially what we see, what I don't get to eventually, what we do see in the early Christian church. Because just like the ancient Israelites had to figure out how to fight against the forces of Babylon and Egypt, the early Christian church had to figure out how do we fight against the imperialism of Rome, which was actively persecuting the Christian church. And they don't do it violently, but they do it through Jiu-Jitsu, which for them, the form of that was to meet communally in homes, to worship together. And that is essentially what we do at the Negev. And the Negev recently was acquired by City Team. We run 6 homes. We're hoping to expand our residency to be able to have 12 guys. And it's my life. And everything that I've shared with you, that would be my challenge to any person here, is that there are whoever marginalized people groups there are in your life. That to me is the ultimate thing that we can do, because that's what I believe that Jesus did. When I look at the Jesus that I believe in, I see that he absolutely prioritized marginalized people groups and shared his life with them, and ultimately shared his death and resurrection with them. And so that is a way that I've lived out my faith and the gospel message in my life. So there are a lot of negative, chaotic forces in this world that we have to fight. But this is just a glimpse into the theology and biblical tradition that has inspired the work that I do. Thank you. I obviously had a million more things to say, but we can have time for questions. Thanks for sticking it out.
Oh my word, there's so much. Whew. I said we'd have time for reflection. Maybe we ought to take a minute or two just to do that. And if anyone absolutely needs to leave, feel free to do that, because we're going to still keep recording. And if you need to go take care of a babysitter or anything else, feel free to exit. But I think we'll take a few minutes of
Yeah, of course.
Just wow.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks so much. I'm remembering now from December, I think it was when you. My question is based on a particular situation that we have in Delaware County. We have a school, Glen Mills, that was created for incarcerating children.
Yes, I'm familiar with the Glen Mills School.
And it's no longer there, but there's
I didn't realize that.
It's
just recently. Oh, I'm really sad to hear that.
It was never did really. I mean, it did continually have problems. It would
Yes.
it would reform and then it would slide back. As I look at this option, is there any real possibility that something like this could be created to work in place of a Glen Mills? As we're looking to the next iteration of a Glen Mills,
Yes.
What would it take to get something like this started?
So what I can tell you what I did. I essentially, every chance I could get, I went to Camp Hill and surrounded myself with their community And I became good friends with Felicity. Felicity is the executive director there. And I would just meet with Felicity and pick her brain. And she's a wonderful woman that has spent her entire life in Camp Hill communities. And so intentional life-sharing community is not romantic. A lot of people romanticize it, but it is hard work, especially when you're working with people of, marginalized people groups with, varying levels of cognitive ability and expression, or whatever people group you're working with. So I would say as much as you can surround yourself with people that have lived and breathed that life-sharing style, because, there's a whole other world to that, right? Felicity's had to navigate what is their relationship with the money economy? What is their relationship with, as a nonprofit? So I think that surrounding yourself with, that's something I'd be happy to facilitate for you. But that's the way I did it. And I constantly go back to them and ask them questions to figure out how they do things. But I would love to see Glen Middle School become something like that. That sounds like a really beautiful idea to me. I love that idea.
Thank you for everything you said. I have two quick questions, and they're not as profound as hers. One is, I tried very hard to take notes on a lot of things you said, and I can't keep up because it went so fast. And there were so many ideas that I really, really was impressed with. Have you written a book? Is there some book that I can refer to get the different things you presented?
I am more than happy, if you give me your contact information, I'm more than happy to give you my notes and the slides.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not a problem at all. It is my hope.
Can we post the slides with the
Oh yeah, I'm happy for you to do that.
recording?
I'm happy for you to do that. That's totally fine.
So people can look at them as they're listening. Good.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm not going to hand it out tonight.
So I can give you and you can.
Absolutely.
All right. The other thing is, what happened to your son?
Oh, he's great. He turns 3 next month. He's very healthy, very happy. He just had his face painted as Spider-Man yesterday, so he was really excited about that. Yeah, and a fresh haircut. In terms of the book, it is my hope to transform this lecture into a book one day. That is my hope.
I think we hope so too.
Oh, that's sweet.
I think I saw this lady's hand. Did you see somebody else before hers?
No, I didn't. What's your name?
Hi.
I went to seminary with this amazing woman named Cinda. Cinda and I went to Westminster together. So
I'm Cinda Martirano. And I love my brother, Raj Lewis.
Oh,
So thank you so much for putting this together in such a
course.
beautiful way to encompass the whole world. The Eastern kata really speaks to me because my middle child, my daughter, was into Japanese anime.
oh yes, I'm familiar.
And still is, and just recently went to Japan for her honeymoon.
That's awesome.
So thank you so much. But my question is about bringing kata into the story of redemption on the cross in the gospel of freedom that we have from addiction. And so I love the beauty of what we're seeing in the harmony and fighting the dragon. Can you expound on that a little bit? Like, how do you see kata in the redemption story on the cross in the gospel of freedom?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a million
Awesome.
things to say about that.
Thank you.
I mean, what I would say, right, is that, there's, the crucifixion happens on the Day of Atonement. We know that, according to the biblical tradition. And for me, when I think about the cross and the resurrection and that tradition of the gospel of freedom, that it's absolutely connected to God's desire to bring liberation to his people. So I would say that although the gospel does have social and political implications, Christ made it clear that he primarily did not come to bring political and social liberation, although he did deeply care about those things. The subtitle of Bruce Alexander's book is, A Study in Poverty of the Spirit. And probably one of the most revolutionary things that Jesus says, in my opinion, is right before he's about to be crucified. And what does he say? He says, my kingdom is not of this world. And when you think about every revolution that's ever taken place, it's about land. It's about land and trade and resources, right? That is typically why humans and systems do really terrible things, is because they want ownership over land and systems and trade and the means of production. But for Jesus to say before his crucifixion that his kingdom is not of this world is ultimately freeing, right? Because you don't see the early Christian church engaged in that sort of activity. They live in that freedom. To me, the ultimate expression of that, how that message of salvation works out in the early church, right, is that it's a contrast to imperialism, right? So when the Holy Spirit in that day of Pentecost comes upon God's people, they're not all speaking in one language, right? They're all speaking in different languages. So there's this kind of diversity that the freedom of the cross gives us that doesn't necessitate imperialism. And that, to me, the salvation from sin, right, is not just personal sin, but it's societal sin, it's communal sin, it's political sin. And I think the early Christian church really did embody that. I hope I'm answering your question. Yeah. We can talk more, Cinda, about the other part. Fighting the dragon. Well, yeah, so how that plays out in the Gospels is ultimately, culminates in the book of Revelation. In John's Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, John pulls from the same dragon imagery to talk about the Roman Empire. When he's talking about the dragon, the red dragon, and the woman, and the beast, these are essentially, metaphors of the draconian force of the Roman Empire that was persecuting the early Christian church. And so Christ's triumph over that dragon ultimately, again, is primarily a spiritual message for the churches at the time, but it does have political and social implications, that the power of the Holy Spirit is stronger. And the power, right, the imagery of the sword coming out of, the mouth of Christ is the gospel message. It is the word of God being preached. And so again, to me, it's Jiu-Jitsu. It's the gentle way, right? That the early Christian church they're not Marxist revolutionaries. They're not trying to overthrow the Roman Empire, but they do defeat the Roman Empire through the preaching of the gospel. Right? Yeah. And that's how the dragon's defeated. That is the sword that comes out of the mouth of Christ.
Except I think some people would say that they married the empire, and that's been our entire downfall since.
There is. So, this is a really good point you're bringing up, So Bruce Alexander actually writes about this in the Globalization of Addiction. He says the problem that he has with Christianity is, he pulls from Augustine in Augustine's book, The City of God. And Augustine basically sort of says, hey, listen, Christians can no longer blame society for any of those problems. Whatever problem you have is on you. And it's basically about your disobedience and your personal sin issues with God. Now, there was another Christian tradition at the time, actually that preceded Augustine, that took a little bit of a different view, and they were known as the Desert Fathers. The Desert Fathers essentially said, hey, listen, this marriage between Christianity and the Roman Empire is not meant to be. It's a corruption I would agree with that. Now, has there been some redemption of that? I think that there has been in some forms. But you're right, there is, it's a conflict between Christianity and imperialism. And I would like to be known as the person that introduced Bruce Alexander to the Desert Fathers, because he sees the Desert Fathers and Mothers actually left Rome at the time and went back into the desert to reenact the desert journey of God's people, to establish small clusters of Christian communities to preserve what they believe to be the most primal expression of the Christian faith. I don't think we can make grand sweeping indictments of Christianity and say, oh, it's all corrupt empire. We do see that historically, but we see that the church has been willing to reform itself over and over again. That has been true too. Those two things have existed together. And so much so that Martin Luther, in Martin Luther's Reformation, he invokes the same sort of dragon imagery when he talks about the Roman Catholic Church. But that's a whole other thing. Go ahead.
Well, chaos keeps reappearing, doesn't it?
Yes.
So, it seems to me another place of redemption.
Hold on to your enthusiasm for just a second.
Okay, it seems to me another place of redemption with regard to Christian religion is liberation theology.
I agree.
And the encouragement there of community and support over against both the hierarchical church,
Right.
for instance, in Latin America, as well as the rich landowners.
Yes.
So there's a place there where the purest form of community, of wholeness and balance and harmony could have happened. Not sure it did, but it could have happened there. It certainly was an introduction through liberation theology.
Right. And I guess to also speak, when we're looking at the prophets, right? I mean, the prophets are essentially the hardest critiques of their own people. When you read the prophets, it's not very pleasurable to read the prophets because they're constantly judging and condemning their own people for being rebellious and stiff-necked. But there's a really positive version of that. It means that they're constantly trying to reform themselves. And I think that the best part of the Christian church or any religion constantly does that. The scariest religions are the ones that are not interested in reforming themselves. That's terrifying to me. But I think the best of the Christian tradition is this willingness to always pursue truth. And I think there can always be healthy debate between traditions. I was waiting for you, Maddie.
Very interesting. Thoroughly enjoyed. I'm finding this about the chaos very interesting. What are your thoughts on this chaos? I mean, has it been in perpetuity? Did it have a beginning date? Will it have a conclusion? And then is there an entity or force behind this chaos? So, because we do see chaos, and I acknowledge that.
Yes.
But what, in your view is, was there a starting point, or has this been the yin and the yang of Easternism?
I understand what you're saying.
Right.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll give you a scientific response as well as a religious one.
Just not a verbal jiu-jitsu response.
No.
Okay.
So it turns out that Einstein had this theory. I was telling John Walsh this the other day. It turns out that Einstein had this theory that there's something that he believed existed in the middle of a galaxy, and he called those black holes. It was just a theory that Einstein had. That at the center of galaxy is the existence of a supermassive black hole that sucks everything into itself. And so the only way to really describe, and scientists even use this language, the only way to really describe that black hole is a monster. It's a dragon. It just wants to devour everything. But yet it turns out that the birth of a galaxy actually requires for a supermassive black hole to be in the center of it. And what we do see scientifically is that the galaxies are able to maintain their spiral shape because of the gravitational force of this devouring dragon at the center of it. Now, there's some force that keeps that supermassive black hole in check that makes life possible on Earth. Now, that's a scientific explanation that I would say, well, that sounds like a dragon that some force is acting upon in order for life to exist. Science has proven that black holes do exist now. And science has proven that black holes are instrumental in the creation of a galaxy in a universe. So that to me gives a scientific explanation of what that is. They say black holes are created. I'm not giving you sort of a religious answer, that black holes are created by the death of a star, right? There's the death of a star, it turns into supernova, and it's sort of this energy release. And that energy release, then sort of like is able to somehow resolve itself in the spinning of a galaxy. Now that's interesting. That's deeply interesting because that says, hey, this isn't just mythology or symbolism, but there is some truth. And I do believe that a lot of what religious scholars call myths, there's probably more connection to real life than we give ancient people credit for. Because the more that we learn about the scientific world, the more like, wait a minute, there are things that are probably what they might be describing. You're probably asking me sort of a problem of evil question. I would say that conflict, as a good psychologist or counselor would say, isn't inherently evil. I don't think that conflict is inherently evil. And so if there was some sort of conflict that happened between God and a black hole, it doesn't have to predicate, or it doesn't have to predispose. The presupposition doesn't have to be that was evil. Now, after what you and I might call the fall of man, does conflict have the potential for evil and wickedness? Absolutely. And I do believe that it will end one day. I do believe that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. we can really end. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you, Raj, so much. I should mention, actually, one attribute that I neglected to mention about Raj is that he is a relatively new member of the Pendle Hill board, and we are so fortunate to have him serving Pendle Hill and our community, as well as those in which he is directly living. So thank you all for coming tonight. I hope we see you all again on another occasion. Don't forget that we have the chorus concert on Wednesday evening at 8 o'clock. Come on by.
Right on.
The Pendle Hill